Yeah, so without further ado, I'll just get started on how to publish your data set. And the parenthetical is with or without a paper, and also at Janelia. So this will be a lot of internal information. Data publication, I tried looking for a definition and I found like 4. So I'm just not going to go through them. If you're curious, I recommend this paper, Data Publication Consensus and Controversies. Has a lot of good info. But my 2 cents on what is data publication. I think data publication is not data sharing, which is sort of just to, one-on-one or with your friends. It's sharing your data with the world. And it's also treating data as a first-class research product. So handling data in much the way you would handle a paper, citing it as you would cite a paper, putting it in your list of references as you would put a paper in your references. So that's sort of what data publication is. And I think of publication as a spectrum from sort of theoretically available to fair, that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So, and you'll see this mindset coming out throughout the talk, that I don't think of publication as like, oh, once it has a DOI, or once it's in a journal, or once it's in a repository. For me, it's just how frustrating is it for someone to find your data and do something useful with it and show the world what they did. So first off, why publish data in a repository? So maybe you have a paper and you have data and you're putting them in separate locations. So the paper is in the journal and the data is in a repository. For one thing, there's just,
Do you define repository in this context?
Repository, like a scholarly data repository. And I'm gonna go through like the different kinds of scholarly data repository, but like Figshare is an example. So there's the whole suite of reasons related to just data fairness, maybe giving credit where credit is due, being able to track which aspect of the study is being reused. So you can see you have your set of citations for the paper and then other citations for the data. And maybe if the data is really popular, you want to be able to tease that out. Or maybe you just want to be kind of a somewhat early adopter of what I think are good principles of reusable research, in which case putting data in a repository would be good. Other common reasons are the data are just too big for the journal. Maybe you want to get a valuable resource out quickly, so you have a tool or a really rich data set and you think the community should have access to that without having to wait for you to go through the peer review process. And finally, maybe you don't want to just share the data, you want to showcase them. So maybe a repository offers sort of a stage where people can really appreciate that this is a high quality data set instead of just burying it in a supplement or something. Another question is this kind of less common situation of publishing data without a paper. And I think the most common reason people might be in this boat is simply the paper is somebody else's job. And it's your job to put the data out there. This is especially common if you're like a user facility or a company and you're like, we just sequence genomes. We don't ask a lot of questions. We just operate the microscopes and we put the data out there as per our agreement, and they may or may not write the paper they thought they were going to write. That's probably the most common situation in which you just publish data. Another situation is maybe you'll just never get around to it, or your interests changed and you're just not going to do those follow-up experiments that you thought you were going to do. In that case, I would still encourage you to publish your data, because the field can still, someone can reuse those data, someone can do those follow-up experiments, the field will benefit and you will still get a citation out of it and you'll still be contributing to science. So I think you should still put it out there. And the third situation I can think of is maybe the data are for educational purposes, or you just sort of produce this data as kind of a byproduct of what your other stuff you were doing, and you think, oh, someone could use this in a benchmarking study or teaching module or something. I'll give a nod to data papers. So I've kind of presented this dichotomy so far of like, well, you can publish data with a paper or without a paper, but data papers are sort of in between. So a data paper is a brief article describing a data set. It's longer than a metadata description in, say, a repository, but it's much shorter than a regular paper. So it'll have like abstract methods, introduction, more than you would put in like Figshare, but much shorter than a paper. And some journals called data journals exclusively or mainly publish data papers. These are kind of the three big ones that I'm aware of. And then there's more journals that publish both regular papers and data papers, and they often call them data notes. Sometimes they're quite short. F1000 and GigaScience are kind of well known for this. GigaScience is as much a repository as it is a journal. It's kind of an outlier. A lot of the BMC journals, not just these two, also publish data notes. And then there's this kind of new Discover series from Springer Nature that sort of advertises that they have a really quick turnaround time. So pretty much the rest of this talk will be about this question: where should I publish my data? Assuming you have data you want to publish for whatever reason. So I'll go through three sort of options available to you: domain repositories, generalist repositories, and then we'll talk about several what I'm calling self-managed solutions. So domain repositories are geared toward a particular field, and these are a really good way to showcase the data, not just share the data. So I would say if you have time and bandwidth, I would say domain repository should probably be your default, because you get a lot of extra kind of bells and whistles with domain repositories. So in talking to people, I've gotten a sense of what are people's domain repositories around Janelia that we tend to use. Obviously, the community standard genomics repositories, especially the Gene Expression Omnibus or GEO. We also use Wormbase and Flybase and AdGene and FPBase, especially for molecular tools. The image data resource is a repository for high quality microscopy images. From what I hear, it's a bit of work to get your images on there, but it's really nice if, and it's meant for images that are sort of meant to be reused. So it's really high quality data and metadata. Dandy, honestly, as far as I can tell, it's mainly this Svoboda lab, who is like not even here anymore, that uses Dandy. But if you have time series data, especially from multiple instruments in sync, I would really consider using NWB and Dandy, that whole ecosystem. CRCNS is a repository for high quality ePhys data, and neurodata.io is kind of a smaller repository for, I don't even know if it's really a repository or more of a project, but it's a smaller space where you can share large microscopy and machine learning data sets. If you want to find additional domain repositories, for microscopy repositories specifically, I would check out this paper, Swedlow et al. 2021, table 2. It's a table of microscopy repositories. The BRAIN Initiative funds and also recommends several repositories, and Re3 Data is a really trustworthy source that sort of curates information about the repositories that are out there. So overall, domain repositories often have nice bonus features you don't get with a generalist repository. So they'll have kind of ways that people can browse the data and interact with the data, because it's data of a certain, they know what kind of data you're sharing. They're often able to accommodate large files. So for example, the image data resource, which I mentioned earlier, I've seen files on there that are like 10 terabytes. And you can't do that with Figshare. And they may reach a wider or more relevant audience. So you may even be thinking about putting your data on like Kaggle, which doesn't issue DOIs, but you might want to reach that audience, which tends to be not necessarily an academic audience. Con, they may have more rigorous standards for metadata and file formats. Obviously, in the long run, this is a pro, it's a good thing, but when you're hastening to publish your data, it may be annoying. For example, NW or Dandy will share your data for free, but it has to be an NWB file format. And maybe the biggest con is that these repositories may lack a long-term preservation strategy. So they may not have a plan for like, what if the company goes out of business? Which leads into the generalist repositories. So these are not geared toward any particular field. They're not even limited to science. They're good for small to medium data, and they're generally very reliable. So they will have a long-term preservation plan for if they go out of business or whatever. They're also government backed, so they're pretty stable and reliable. In the United States, when we talk about generalist repositories, we're usually referring to the gray repositories. This is an NIH initiative that's funding these 7 repositories and they call it what they have, like a co-opetition model. So in exchange for getting this government money, they kind of agree to work together and decide collectively what features they're going to offer and what things they're going to require. So if it kind of feels like these companies are all really, really similar and like they have a little bit of a monopoly on the market, that's sort of by design, for better or for worse. If you're curious, both of these URLs lead to the same resource where you can compare the gray repositories in terms of maximum file size, cost to the researcher, version support, and so you can see what differentiates them. But
we're not seeing that in this.
Huh?
We're not seeing the PDF.
Oh, yeah. No, I want you all to be able to see all of my little pop-ups. So let's see what we can do here. Can't see it. Is anyone like a Zoom screen sharing expert here?
Just share.
Share the whole desktop.
Or the whole desktop.
That's what I thought I was doing.
Oh, it's-
Now it is. Okay. So that chart is there mainly for the YouTube audience. If you're at Janelia, I would strongly recommend Figshare because we have an institutional account. Go to janeliafigshare.com, janelia.figshare.com, and see our data. So it's very nice if you could just be part of that if it doesn't really matter that much to you. Pros of Figshare, we have plenty of storage space. The team is pretty responsive to requests, the Figshare team. So we can submit support tickets and they're good about those. We get personalized support from Anna Van Gulik and the Figshare team. So Anna we have a relationship with her. She knows what kind of data we put there, and she's really responsive to, like, if you're like, I have some weird wacky data set, how should I put it on Figshare? She can help you with that. Cons, the UI leaves a lot to be desired. It's not browsable, it's searchable, but it's not browsable. The uploads are slow. I would not recommend Figshare for files above like 50 gigabytes or like maybe 100. There are people who have put things on Figshare that are like hundreds of gigabytes or 1 or 2 terabytes, but those things cost a fortune and they take forever. So if you want to do that, you'll probably need a computer dedicated to the Figshare upload for like a couple of weeks. So I would not recommend doing that. I would go to a domain repository. Note on but it's a repository for protocols. We also have an institutional account on protocols.io. I've talked to a couple people around Janelia and I've heard mixed things. So one person said, I would recommend protocols.io as a way to share experiments that don't change frequently. It reduced the burden on me to have to sort of email this stuff. Somebody else said, I found the interface somewhat clumsy, and they found posting on Janelia.org was a viable alternative. So if you have a protocol that you're proud of that you want to share with the world, I would say give protocols.io a try. And if you get frustrated with it, we have alternatives. That's pretty much
David,
what
did
I'll
you?
say. Yeah.
This is maybe a weird interjection, but that comment
Oh, by all
about
means.
that comment about this protocols.io being better for protocols that aren't changing very frequently kind of just reminds me of software development. You don't necessarily want to like start giving away your code until it feels more stable. And that makes me wonder if there's not anything out there for wet lab protocols that's more like a repository, like a Git repository. Like you start with an initial version of your protocol. As you're doing experiments, you make modifications like, oh, I want to double this wash step. I want to order my reagent from a different supplier. Is there anything out there like that keeps track of the changes in your wet lab protocol over time as you improve sample preparation?
Michael says Git.
Yeah, I think people should just use Git for it. I agree, but
Yeah, I mean, anyone can feel free to chime in. My impression is that in theory, protocols.io can do that. In practice, it is maybe not as elegant as Git. So yeah, I'm not aware of a super sleek solution for that.
okay, thanks.
So with that, I'll move on to the self-managed solutions, which will be the rest of the talk. So basically publishing data outside of a repository. Two things you're going to need to think about if you're going outside of a repository are licensing and DOIs. So I'll talk about licensing first. A license is a legal contract that outlines acceptable uses of a piece of intellectual property. I should also say that this is not my area of expertise. Mike Parham is in the room. If you have questions about licensing, you should talk to him. But I'll try to do it justice here. So we do have a robust set of policies regarding licensing and papers. And the main one is this open access policy that says we should use the CC BY 4.0 license unless you have an excellent reason not to. As far as data, we don't really have quite the same thing. We have publication policies that make mentions of data. And so we can sort of pull together the policy from that. But it's not like one document. That's what I just said. But I talked to Mike before this talk, and he said, essentially the central aim is for the study to be reproducible by those inside and outside of Janelia. That's sort of the spirit guiding all of these licensing policies. Reproducibility. So what the policy actually says is that you should make data, software, and tangible research materials that are integral to the publication available for research purposes on reasonable terms. The two exceptions are if the data can be readily reproduced from the information in the paper, or if it can be readily obtained from a company or something. And if the data set is integral to the research but is too large to be included in the publication, the author should make it available on reasonable terms by other means. So I think the most interesting takeaway from this is what it doesn't say. It doesn't say that you must use a certain kind of repository, that you must make all of your data available, that you must use a particular license, or that the data must be in a certain format. So it's pretty generous, and maybe in the future there will be a more kind of deliberate policy document on our data publication policy. But for now, we're pretty flexible, and that's been working well for us so far. And I should say anyone can feel free to also speak up if you have, well, maybe not completely arbitrary feelings, but if you have comments to add, speak up.
I guess I do have a question about licenses.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, one of the things that I think is important about open source software licenses is liability statements. The maybe low probability, but still relevant concern is that somebody in some random place downloads your software, uses it, accidentally spends 30 grand on AWS, and then tries to, sue you for the bill. And that's what these liability clauses are meant to protect you from, these kinds of situations. I don't know if I can think of any off the top of my head, but is that important for open source data also, protecting yourself from incorrect conclusions from the data or fraudulent uses of the data? Somebody downloading your data from Figshare, making some changes, publishing it, and then it being discovered that that something about it was incorrect. To me, that seems like the most of my open source software, that's the only part that I actually care about in the open source license. I use the MIT license, which basically says, as long as you don't sue me, you can do whatever you want with the software. And I would probably feel the same way about data. I just don't know what the concerns are and whether or not there are licenses that take these kinds of things into consideration.
Anytime there's an unknown from that sort of legal aspect, there is a concern because it's an unknown. For example, if you put out some piece of data and someone decides to put that into their diagnostic tool without your, encouragement or anything, that's our worst nightmare.
That's a great example.
That's basically the example. So we do want as many liability provisions as we can get.
Are those standard in the licenses for the repositories that you talked about? Or is it something that you have to proactively do yourself? Like if I upload to Figshare, do I have to say, in addition to Figshare's licenses, I have my own protections that I want attached to this data?
That's a great question. As far as the Creative Commons stuff, I am not certain. CC BY basically means give us credit and you can otherwise share it as you will. I'd actually have to dig deeper into the terms, but this is when the stuff comes up. There's so many different versions of giving away things that we focus a lot on the software. That's why we usually ask people to use the BSD3, but it's very similar to the MIT where it has all those aggressive liability provisions. But Creative Commons, I will have to look at that.
Yeah, I didn't even think of it, but your point about diagnostic tools is a really relevant one. Like somebody uses your data to train a machine learning classifier that tells everybody that they don't have cancer, but they do. These are maybe paranoid thoughts, but it just seems like when you release something completely to the open world, that these kind of things could happen, and that I personally would want that kind of protection in my license.
Absolutely. And I have way more conversations than I'd like to have with legal about every minute technology we have making our way into some, startups little thing that they sell to somebody else. And then the problem is that HHMI is the big money bag. And if there's no one else in the way that has given us, freedom from liability or also has big money bags, whoever got hurt is coming to us. And even if we had nothing to do with it. So that's obviously these are real edge cases, but that's why lawyers exist.
Awesome, good discussion. I didn't know any of that. So that's really helpful for me. And hopefully for all of you. Okay, let's move on to persistent identifiers, if there's no other questions about licensing. So you should get a persistent identifier so people can cite your data set. It creates a sort of provenance in a common language that people recognize and machines recognize. So by far the most popular persistent identifier is a DOI. DOIs are a great way to cite and be cited. If you want to learn more about DOIs, you can check out the DOI Foundation. They are sort of the overarching entity that manages DOIs. But yeah, it's just well, I'll talk about what a DOI is. A DOI is essentially a URL redirect, or sort of like a resolution service, so that the DOI will take you to a web page. The DOI issuers also store metadata. So for example, ISBN is another persistent identifier. Maybe when you were a student, you remember getting textbooks by the ISBN. That one doesn't have any metadata associated with it. The DOI does. And there are other persistent identifiers too. DOI is the big one for scholarly materials in particular. For a journal article, the DOI should resolve to the article. And if it's a data set, the DOI should resolve to a landing page, which contains some information and a link to the data. So that's best practice, is to go to a landing page first. And a DOI is meant to be persistent and stable. The idea being, if you publish something and the journal goes out of business, or the repository changes its name, and maybe the URL has changed, the DOI will always be the same and will always redirect to the place on the web where that resource can be found. And it's best practice to write the DOI as a URL with the HTTPS : // These are older ways of writing DOIs, the DOI : or DX. Those are no longer kind of the recommended way.
So can I ask about that? Why is that the recommended practice? Do you know the rationale behind it?
It's just, I can speculate. I think it's just to sort of emphasize that this is the purpose of a DOI, that you can just put it into your browser like that. That being said, not everybody does it that way. It's not the end of the world.
So the counterpoint is, I can imagine a future world where we're not using HTTPS, and then those links break, right? Whereas the DOI is always going to be forever identifier.
I believe that's why they had this older notation of DOI, that it was like actually a different web protocol,
Right.
like the DOI protocol, and then they were like, HTTPS is not going anywhere. We're just going to use that. That's as much as I know. Let's see, I have a comment in the chat. Oh, this was a question about licensing. The section from Bill Katz. I think he's basically pointing us to section 12 of the Creative Commons license that might have some stuff about the liability issues that Greg brought up. So yeah, I was going to show you an example of a landing page, but I think it's a fairly straightforward concept. We can come back to that later if it's not clear. So for our purposes, there's two main DOI issuers. There are other smaller ones, but for our purposes, these are the two big ones. There's Crossref and DataCite. Essentially, basically, Crossref issues DOIs for papers and DataCite issues DOIs for data, more or less. So individuals cannot be members of Crossref or DataCite. Their members are organizations. So Crossref members are generally journals and publishers, and DataCite members are generally repositories. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. So I'll just finish my thought here, which is that Figshare is a member of DataCite. HHMI is also a member of DataCite. So we pay DataCite a little money every year so that we have the ability to issue our own DOIs. So if you want a DOI, you can go to Figshare, and you probably should, or you can go to us if you need to. I will pause here and check out what's going on in the chat. Okay, this is turning into a conversation. I'll just move ahead and say DOI is a big responsibility. As Uncle Ben said, great power comes great responsibility. So DOI issuers will maintain some metadata about your DOI, but it's your responsibility to make sure the metadata are accurate. Basically, everything about the DOI is your responsibility, and they just offer metadata and a lot of recommendations and guidelines. The links need to be maintained in perpetuity, whatever that means, theoretically forever. And once a DOI is public, it can't be deleted. So if you do need to essentially delete a DOI that you've created, the way to deal with that is to create a tombstone page, which has an explanation of why the resource isn't there and basically who you can talk to find that resource. So if you're going to create a DOI, you better be really sure that you want it and that you'll take on that responsibility.
Do you have any idea how this works in practice? Do people do that? I mean, it sounds like.
I mean, repositories do it. I don't know how many individuals do it. Yeah, I mean, I would hope it's kind of common sense, but it's not always clear that there's different stages of the DOI. So there's like a draft DOI, that one can be deleted, but then once you have like a public findable DOI, that can't be deleted. So that might not be clear to people. Probably the most common question I get about DOIs is about versioning. Basically, it's a hard question to answer because there are no hard rules. It's just sort of guidelines. Basically, for small revisions, you should use the DOI metadata, and for big revisions, you should create a new DOI. What constitutes a small or a big revision is basically up to you. So you can create relationships between different DOIs through the metadata. These are just two pairs of metadata fields that relate specifically to versioning here. But there are lots and lots of DOI metadata fields that you can use to say, oh, this paper cited that data set or whatever. So you can sort of create relationships in that way. There's also this concept of like a canonical DOI that encompasses all of the versions. That's a way of arranging your metadata to make it clear that it's a canonical DOI. So there are ways to do this. They're kind of obscure. Most people don't know about them. Most people don't know how to access DOI metadata. This would be something that, a repository is talking to the DataCite API to get this metadata. So it's not really stuff you can do on your own. But if you do want to learn more about a DOI, a DataCite DOI on your own, you can check out commons.datacite.org, which is the closest thing to that's not a link. I have to copy it. Yeah, that's sort of the closest thing to like a user-friendly way to query DOI metadata. So, okay, in this case, you actually have to remove the HTTPS, but their guidelines do say you're supposed to include the HTTPS. So in this case, I put in a DOI for this paper, and you can see here that there's version 1, here's version 3. So that's a way that you can handle versioning, is to put it in the metadata.
But if you put the DOI for this one directly, it jumps to the latest version or shows you that web page?
It takes me to Zenodo, and Zenodo tells me there's a new version. So Zenodo is actually reading, I believe it's reading the DOI metadata.
So it still points to version 1, not to version 3, the direct link, and you can't update that as you go.
So that would
So it's a
be,
bit like the bioarchive thing too, right? Like you always have to click then.
yeah. So that's the kind of thing that is why DOI is a big responsibility. There's a lot of ways to screw it up.
Figshare does it the other way where they put V1, V2, V3, and then they take you to the latest. If you put that in without the V's, it takes you to the latest V.
For bioarchive.
What's that?
For Figshare.
For Figshare.
Okay.
So, yeah, different.
So it's also not consistent across DOIs how this is done, basically.
Archive also works this way. Like, takes you to the latest, best V1, V2, and so on.
Yeah, I think Zenodo also has a mechanism for that you could link to the
Yes.
latest.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Like the whole thing. Just have to have that version of the link. Yeah, so different repositories will have different ways of giving you sort of a master link, I guess, often, for lack of a better word. Also, quick nod to, so the tools for tracking data citations are not great, to be frank. You sort of need programming skills, and even then, it's not super easy. But a more comprehensive tool for exploring the world's data citations is being made, in large part by Chan Zuckerberg initiative, but also, and DataCite and Make Data Count are kind of working together to create what they're calling an open global data citation corpus that will in theory be sort of the definitive place to go if you want to find out who is citing what data, with like little dashboards and stuff. But it's sort of in the prototype stage right now, but something to be aware of. Okay, any other questions before I switch into putting your data on the web? So I'm gonna go through three different options here for publishing data on the web. Option number one is GitHub. Arguably the most popular data repository in the world is GitHub. People use it for code, obviously, but people also use it for data. If you have text files or PDFs, not great, but you could, or spreadsheets, things like that. Obviously, it's only suitable for smallish files. So if you have files that are greater than, you know, like a gigabyte, you might start wondering whether GitHub is ideal. And yeah, I think that's pretty much. There's also this thing called ZetHub, XET Hub, that sort of markets itself as like Git for data. I don't know much about it. I don't know, I doubt anyone here has used it, but that's a thing you can look into that supposedly allows for much more generous file sizes. So one nice thing, as many of you know, is that GitHub allows you to easily create a website using GitHub Pages and the Jekyll framework. Probably some people in this room know more about this than I do. This is one created by Frank, who's in the room here. And he was kind enough to share this really nice GitHub Pages website that he made for some of his hardware and protocols. So that's a super big advantage of GitHub if you have sort of small data or you're just trying to share information. Some tips from Frank are you can get started with just 11 lines of code. If you want to look at this recording and look at this URL here, you can see his config file. Frank uses this thing called Ruby Gems, which I'm not really familiar. I don't know, do you want to say?
Yeah, mine, to be honest, I just copy and pasted that from like GitHub description, and it's really just, I mean, you understand what those lines mean.
Yeah.
I wouldn't write them myself. It's super easy to get started. There are a lot of resources how to do it.
Okay. So yeah, pro tip for people who want to look into that. And then he also recommends just the docs.com as one of many templates out there, but it's an easy to use one for creating a GitHub website. You can also integrate DOIs into GitHub, again, using Frank's stuff as an example. So he actually uses Zenodo's GitHub integration features to automatically, so when he publishes a new release, it automatically gets a new DOI and a Zenodo page. And this is kind of what we were talking about, where you can get like a badge that will always go to the latest version. Figshare also has something like this. It has the Figshare upload GitHub action. I've never used it. I don't know how well it works. But in theory, you could also do this with Figshare.
You
Bill
know
Katz
if
says-
Figshare has a badge kind of thing like that?
I don't know. I just kind of glanced at this and I didn't see anything suggesting that they have a badge, a DOI badge.
There was a time a little while ago where I had mentioned that it seemed like Zenodo had a more comfortable experience for getting DOIs for code, and these are sort of some examples of it. And I kind of felt like some folks were pushing back on that and saying, well, you really ought to use Figshare because that's the Janelia way.
I mean, maybe I shouldn't say this, but like, if you really don't want to use Figshare, like, I don't want to force you to use Figshare. Like, I want you to be, be a team player and use Figshare. But if that's not a compelling enough reason for you, if you really prefer some feature that Zenodo offers, then use Zenodo. And yeah, if you go to Figshare and you go to their integrations tab, there is like a GitHub integration thing. But I mean, yeah, if you want to explore that and let me know how it goes, I'd be curious to hear more about your experience. Bill Katz added in the chat that Ruby gems is just a fancy word for code that can be shared like packages. So you can see that URL for the gem that Frank was using. Okay, unless there are other comments about Git for data. I'm not going to say much about hosting data on the cloud because I don't know much about it. And there are other people in the room who can say much more. Suffice to say that that's an option if you like using these tools. And you may or may not be aware that a lot of people here use this combination. Well, not a lot of people. A couple project teams use this combination of Amazon S3 Quilt. Quilt is it's sort of like a tool for packaging and versioning data. They sort of market themselves as having some of the features of Docker and some of the features of GitHub, but for data. So it's a way to do kind of branched versioning of data sets and so forth. You can create a Quilt repository or registry, I think, and add to it. I don't know that much about it, but it's also, it also has a very cute interface where you can have information and you can have sort of like a file system experience for exploring your bucket. And there's also ways that people can programmatically access whatever version of the data they want as well. And that is only available with Amazon S3. So not just any cloud provider using S3 protocols, but like actual Amazon brand S3. So that's pretty much all I have to say about that, unless certainly anyone else can chime in.
I just add in that when you start working on the cloud, like the budget and stuff is also on you. The repositories are either free or we pay for the premium stuff, but when you start working in this more advanced space, you both need someone who's an expert in it and to figure out how to pay for it.
There's also the Amazon open data stuff, right? So they would pay for those repositories.
That's correct, but that's an application process. You're proposing to them to put it up and they review and decide whether to include it.
And it's every 3 years, right? You got to renew, but they frequently renew it. I guess one question that I had, and this isn't just about Quilt, but about Figshare and Zenodo and stuff, is that what is are there any guarantees about the longevity of these things, or like how are they financed? I guess we can be kind of sure that Amazon S3 probably won't disappear anytime soon, and probably the largest providers, but I always wonder about the smaller ventures.
You can look You can actually look at that chart that I linked to earlier comparing the 7 gray repositories, but you can look and see Figshare's like long-term archival plan to some extent. I don't know if you'll find information about what if we go out of business.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was more concerned about, not what they're saying they would provide, but what happens, like, because the whole point of this stuff, right, is that it's a permanent place for data and you don't have to worry about it. And
I would need to double check, but I think Zenoda is attached to CERN, to the European, like, Hadron Collider thing. And they have all this long time archival built in and backed by the European Union, as far as I know. But
I see, that's pretty cool. So they're EU backed, essentially.
as far as I understood, yeah, I don't remember.
In our contract with Figshare, we have all these, not necessarily redundancies, but all that stuff is ours. So they hand it all back to us, including a version of Figshare. If they go out of business, we get our own version of Figshare with all of our stuff. Now, obviously, that's going to be very painful. I'm going to be coming to beg you to help me figure that out, or somebody is. But nothing will disappear.
You mean as part of the contract, we get their actual code to stand up, like we can do our own on-premises Figshare? Or do
That's
you just mean
correct.
that we get the data without all of their?
As I recall, now I'd done this 7 years ago, we get the whole thing. We get, if they're going out of business, there are provisions. It's not like we're going to somehow sneak around behind them and become a
Right.
competitor. If
Right.
they are going out of business, they have all of their code base in I forget the word right now, I'm blanking, speaking in front of everyone, but they have a copy of it sitting somewhere, and they will give that to us
Oh,
so
that's
that
cool.
it can interface. And Figshare is on Amazon. Figshare is just a front on AWS, like everything else in the world. So
I see.
that's going to sit there. They're going to give us the code base for Figshare if they go out of business, and then we're going to figure out how to either link it back up or whatever we decide to do at that point.
Including access to the DOIs.
Yes.
Wow.
And the DOIs, we own the DOIs too. Those DOIs are actually on our data site account. We just did that switch recently where we initially subscribed and they were doing everything for us. Then we became members of data site, and we said, just put all, otherwise we're paying twice. So those are all that's all our stuff now too. So like Figshare really is, in my mind, it's a couple things. It's like a nice cover for AWS that provides the DOIs, and we get the support from Anna and her team. And it's like a centralized place. It's not very expensive, but that's what it is. The stuff, the guts are just pieced together from all the same pieces that we use for other stuff.
That sounds pretty good. That actually sounds really good in terms of like the backup plan. And I guess that if something like a Quilt also had that kind of provision, then that would also, be painful, but at least it would still mean that, all your data would still be there, and you'd have to take over the cost, but there's a yeah.
Yeah.
That's neat.
I can't speak much to that. Maybe someone else here knows Quilt better than I do. Yeah, I would need to look into it.
Escrow, that's the word I was trying to think of. The code is an escrow.
Escrow, I love it.
Sorry.
If that's that, I'll move on to option 3, which is a Janelia managed website. And at this stage, I will edit out the next part of the talk from the YouTube recording because it's going to be a lot of internal stuff that won't apply to our YouTube viewers. Okay, and at this point, I will welcome back the YouTube audience for the conclusion, just to say that more and more data publication is being recognized as an accomplishment in its own right. It can help you reach your career goals as a researcher. Data papers are a viable way of sharing data with the world quickly. I outlined 3 ways to publish data: domain repositories, generalist repositories, and hosting it yourself, with several different routes for that. Hosting it yourself is a big responsibility. You'll need to think about licensing and DOIs. So come talk to all of the people I mentioned in this PowerPoint. Don't just do it yourself. And Janelia has 3 internal processes for getting a website, depending on what kind of website you want.
Can you share your slides?
I can share my slides on Wiki, yes.
Does, we put stuff on research.janelia.org, is that still? Like, I can get to it, but it doesn't seem to be working.
I also went to research.janelia.org and it didn't seem to be working,
Yeah,
but I don't know
that's not good.
what the story is.
I think that's on a VM that's hosting multiple things at once. I'm not sure what the current status of it is.
Okay, so an email SciComm systems probably questions about that. Yeah, that's about it.